Passengers began pouring into the terminal. Families
Subscribe.
reunited. Children ran into waiting arms. Travelers pushed suitcases through the crowd. Emily scanned each face while holding the bouquet against her chest. Then she saw him. At first, she noticed only the way he walked. Something about it felt familiar. The confident stride, the slight tilt of his shoulders, the expression of someone who had spent years carrying responsibilities few people understood. Then he stepped closer, and Emily saw his face. The flowers nearly slipped from her hands. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, because the man approaching her wasn't Richard Sullivan's cousin. Or at least he wasn't only Richard Sullivan's cousin. He was Daniel Brooks, the man she had loved, the man who had vanished from her life 20 years earlier, the man who had broken her heart without explanation. And standing beside him was a beautiful blonde woman wearing an engagement ring. Emily had spent 2 decades convincing herself she no longer cared. But in that instant, she realized some wounds never completely heal. For several seconds, Emily Carter stood frozen in the middle of the crowded terminal, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to convince herself that what she was seeing was real. 20 years. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of wondering why the man she loved had disappeared without a goodbye. 20 years of replaying every conversation, every argument, every memory, searching for clues she might have missed. And now Daniel Brooks was standing less than 20 feet away from her, as though those years had never happened. What frightened her most wasn't the sight of him. It was the realization that she still recognized him instantly. Tom had changed them both. There was more gray in his hair, more lines around his eyes. The confidence he once carried so effortlessly now seemed weighed down by something heavier. Yet somehow, beneath all those changes, he was still the same Daniel she remembered from years ago. The Daniel who used to bring her coffee before work. The Daniel who promised they would build a future together. The Daniel who swore he would never leave. Then left anyway. As Daniel moved closer through the crowd, Emily felt emotions she thought had disappeared years ago begin rising to the surface. Anger, confusion, sadness, regret. None of them had truly vanished. She had simply learned how to bury them beneath responsibilities and survival. The blonde woman beside him smiled warmly. Emily immediately noticed the engagement ring. It wasn't a small ring. It was impossible to miss. For reasons she couldn't explain, that tiny detail hurt more than seeing Daniel himself. Because while Emily had spent years rebuilding her life after losing him, Daniel appeared to have moved forward completely. At least that was what she believed. Emily. The sound of her name brought her back to reality. Daniel's voice was deeper than she remembered, but it was still his voice. The same voice she once listened to for hours while they planned a future neither of them would ever get to have. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Neither seemed to know what to say. Then the woman beside him stepped forward. "Hi, you must be Emily. I've heard so much about you." The words hit Emily harder than she expected. "You've heard so much about you." What exactly had Daniel told her? And why would he be talking about Emily after 20 years? Emily forced a smile. Years of professionalism had taught her how to hide emotions even when everything inside her was falling apart. She handed over the bouquet. The woman accepted it gratefully. "Thank you. These are beautiful." Emily nodded politely. Daniel continued staring at her. Not in the way she expected. Not with confidence. Not with indifference. Not with the casual friendliness of someone reconnecting with an old acquaintance. There was something else in his expression. Something she couldn't identify. And for the first time since seeing him, Emily began to suspect that Daniel was just as surprised by this reunion as she was. The drive from the airport was painfully quiet. Emily sat behind the wheel while Daniel and his fiancée occupied the back seat. Traffic moved slowly. The silence felt endless. Every few minutes, she glanced into the rearview mirror. Each time she did, she found Daniel looking out the window as though lost in thought. The woman beside him occasionally attempted small talk, but even she seemed aware that something unusual was happening. Emily couldn't stop wondering why. Why had Daniel never called? Why had he never written? Why had he vanished so completely? Most importantly, why had he returned now? Questions she had carried for 2 decades suddenly felt heavier than ever. As the miles passed, Emily found herself drifting back to the years after Daniel disappeared. Those had been the hardest years of her life. When Daniel left, she was 33 years old. They had been together for nearly 7 years. Friends expected wedding invitations. Family members assumed an engagement announcement was coming. Even Emily believed marriage was only a matter of time. Then everything changed. One morning she woke up and Daniel was simply gone. No explanation. No note. No warning. His apartment had been emptied. His phone number disconnected. His social media accounts deleted. It was as though he had vanished from existence. At first, Emily believed there had been some terrible misunderstanding. She convinced herself he would return. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. Daniel never came back. The emotional damage was devastating. But the financial damage was equally severe. Many people didn't know that Emily and Daniel had planned to start a business together. She had invested nearly all her savings into that dream. When Daniel disappeared, the dream disappeared with him. Suddenly, Emily found herself facing debts she hadn't expected and responsibilities she wasn't prepared to carry alone. She worked overtime. She accepted second jobs. Some weeks, she barely slept. There were nights when she sat alone at her kitchen table, wondering how her life had fallen apart so quickly. Meanwhile, everyone around her seemed to be moving forward. Friends got married. Families grew. Careers flourished. Emily survived. But surviving wasn't the same as living. The years eventually taught her how to function without answers. She focused on work. She cared for her aging mother. She helped support her younger brother after his divorce. Whenever life became difficult, Emily showed up. Whenever someone needed help, she was there. She became the person everyone depended on. The problem was that nobody realized how much she was struggling herself. Because strength can be deceptive. People see someone carrying heavy burdens and assume they're fine. They don't see the exhaustion. They don't see the loneliness. They don't see the moments when that person sits awake at 2 in the morning wondering if things will ever get better. Emily knew those moments well. And now, after 20 years, the man responsible for many of them was sitting in the back seat of her car. Yet the more she thought about it, the more something felt wrong. If Daniel had truly walked away because he stopped loving her, why did he look so uncomfortable? Why did he seem unable to meet her eyes? Why did he look like a man carrying a secret? Emily didn't know it yet. But before the day was over, she would discover that the story she had believed for 20 years was missing one critical piece. A piece so important that once it was revealed, nothing about her past would ever look the same again. The remainder of the drive passed in a blur. Emily Carter kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, focusing on the road ahead while trying to ignore the storm of emotions building inside her. Every instinct told her to ask the questions she had carried for 20 years. Every instinct told her to pull the car over and demand answers. But another part of her refused to give Daniel Brooks that satisfaction. If he wanted to explain why he disappeared, he could do it on his own. When they arrived at the hotel, Emily stepped out first and helped unload the luggage. Daniel thanked her politely, almost formally. The distance between them felt strange. Once upon a time, they could communicate without speaking. Now, they were acting like complete strangers. His fiancée smiled warmly. "We'll see you tonight at dinner, right?" Emily nodded. "Of course." Then she returned to her car and drove away. The moment she pulled into a nearby parking lot, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking. 20 years. 20 years of imagining this moment. And somehow reality felt even worse than the versions she had imagined. On the drive home, memories kept resurfacing. Daniel teaching her how to drive a stick shift. Daniel helping her paint the tiny apartment, the